I was halfway through a chapter when my daughter-in-law reached over, pressed her palm against the open pages, and shut my novel with a sharp clap. "Enough of this nonsense," Melissa said, sliding the book away from me. "In this house we read things that matter." She picked up a thick financial magazine from the coffee table and placed it in front of me, as if she were assigning homework to a child. I looked toward my son. Eric didn't even hesitate. "She's right, Dad," he said with a tired shrug. "You spend too much time living in stories." For a second, nobody spoke. 40 years of teaching literature, reduced to a lecture in my own living room. Melissa folded her arms. "You've been sitting here reading for almost 2 hours. Maybe if you focused on something practical, you'd stop dwelling on the past." I slowly removed my reading glasses. I didn't realize enjoying a novel required permission. "It doesn't," she replied, "but wasting your retirement does." Eric stood, picked up my novel, and placed it on the bookshelf across the room. "There," he said, "now maybe you'll try something more useful." I stared at him. Not because he'd moved the book. Because he'd chosen a side. I stood carefully, leaning on my cane from the hip surgery I'd undergone only a few months earlier. "Thank you," I said quietly. Melissa smiled, clearly expecting an argument she could win. Instead, I walked out of the room. Neither of them realized that before breakfast that morning, I'd already scheduled an appointment that would change every one of our lives. By sunset, they would be pounding on my bedroom door. And nothing either of them said would undo what had already begun. My name is Jonathan Carter. I'm 69 years old, and for 40 years I taught literature at Roosevelt High School. I wasn't the teacher who gave impossible exams. I was the teacher who believed stories mattered because they taught people how to recognize themselves and each other. Many of my former students became lawyers, doctors, engineers, police officers, and judges. Years later, they still wrote to tell me they remembered the books far more than the grades. To me, novels were never an escape. They were reminders that every choice carried consequences. Ironically, I had failed to apply that lesson inside my own family. After my hip replacement surgery, Eric insisted I recover in his home. "Dad," he'd said, "there's no point staying alone while you're healing. You've always taken care of me. Let me finally return the favor." I believed him. During the first few weeks, everything felt warm and welcoming. Melissa cooked my favorite meals. Eric drove me to follow-up appointments. They insisted I focus on recovering. But little things began changing. The television channels I watched disappeared from the favorites list. The newspapers I subscribed to stopped arriving. The chair where I usually read slowly became stacked with Melissa's work folders until there was barely room to sit. Every change was small enough to dismiss. Together, they painted a very different picture. When Melissa closed my novel that afternoon, I realized it wasn't about a book anymore. It was about deciding whether I still had the right to choose anything for myself. I walked upstairs, entered my bedroom, and opened the small leather folder I'd carried out of the house earlier that day. Everything inside was exactly where it needed to be. I slipped it back into my briefcase, collected only the belongings that truly mattered, and quietly left through the front door while Eric and Melissa were still at work. Hours later, they returned expecting dinner already cooking. Instead, the house was silent. "Dad," Eric called. No answer. He climbed the stairs. My bedroom door was locked. He knocked once, then harder. "Dad." Still nothing. Melissa frowned. "Jonathan, open this door." The knocking became pounding, then hammering. Eric's voice grew louder. "Dad, are you all right?" Melissa suddenly pointed toward the wall beside the door. Eric. A sealed envelope had been taped there. He reached toward it. At that exact moment, headlights swept across the front windows as a car pulled into the driveway. The front door opened before Eric could reach the stairs. A middle-aged man in a gray suit stepped inside carrying a slim leather briefcase. "Good evening," he said calmly. "I'm looking for Mr. Eric Carter." Eric hurried downstairs. "I'm Eric." The man extended a business card. "My name is David Holloway. I'm an attorney. Mr. Jonathan Carter asked me to stop by this evening if I didn't hear from him first." Melissa immediately crossed her arms. "Attorney, what is this about?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss that just yet." Eric looked confused. "My father's upstairs. He locked himself in his room." The attorney glanced toward the staircase. "Has anyone opened that door?" "No." "Then I suggest you don't force it." Melissa scoffed. "He's an elderly man recovering from surgery. We're making sure he's all right." The attorney gave a polite nod. "If that's your concern, then I understand." He turned and walked back toward the door. "I'll return tomorrow." Before either of them could ask another question, he was gone. Silence settled over the house. Melissa looked irritated. "This is ridiculous." Eric hurried back upstairs and carefully peeled the envelope from the wall. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it. Only one sentence appeared in my handwriting. "Please don't force this to become harder than it already is." Eric read it twice. Melissa reached over and snatched it from his hand. "What does that even mean?" Neither of them had an answer. Eric knocked again. "Dad, if you're upset about earlier, let's just talk." No reply. Melissa rolled her eyes. "He's trying to make us feel guilty." Eric wasn't so sure anymore. He leaned against the bedroom door. For the first time that day, he noticed something unusual. The hallway bookshelf looked emptier. Dad had more books than this. Melissa barely glanced up. "I donated a few boxes last week." Eric turned toward her. "You what?" "They were collecting dust." "You didn't tell him." "I didn't need permission to declutter." Downstairs, Eric opened the hall closet. Several shelves that had always held my storage boxes were now completely empty. He climbed back upstairs. My bedroom door remained locked. Hours earlier, long before Melissa had snapped my novel shut, I had already noticed those missing boxes. Not because I had been looking for them. Because one of them contained the last letters my late wife had ever written to me. When I couldn't find it, I didn't accuse anyone. Instead, I quietly took photographs of every empty shelf. Then I searched my phone. Months of saved text messages. Pictures. Dates. Receipts. Even security camera screenshots from the front porch showing boxes leaving the house. That morning's appointment hadn't been arranged because of one insult. It had been arranged because that insult was simply the final page of a much longer story. Back upstairs, Eric slowly folded my note. He stared at the bedroom door. Then he whispered to himself, "Why would Dad think we'd make this harder?" For the first time, he wasn't asking about the locked room. He was asking about everything that had led to it. Before sunrise, the pounding started again. "Jonathan." Eric struck the bedroom door with the side of his fist. "Dad, please answer." The silence on the other side was absolute. Melissa stood behind him with her phone in one hand. "This has gone far enough," she said. "Call a locksmith." Within 30 minutes, a locksmith's van pulled into the driveway. The repeated knocking had already drawn attention. Mrs. Henderson from across the street stepped onto her porch. Then Mr. Alvarez walked over from next door. Two more neighbors wandered outside, curious about the commotion. Eric looked embarrassed. "We think my father may have locked himself in," Melissa answered before anyone else could speak. "He's been getting difficult lately." Mrs. Henderson frowned. "Difficult?" Melissa sighed dramatically. "Forgetful, emotional. He gets attached to strange things." She laughed softly. "Yesterday he became upset because I cleaned out some old books." Eric lowered his eyes. He hasn't really been himself. The words left his mouth, but they felt heavier than he expected. The locksmith inserted his tools. A few clicks later, the bedroom door swung open. Everyone leaned forward. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The closet doors stood open. Most of Jonathan's clothes were gone. His favorite reading chair sat beside the window. The small lamp beside it remained plugged in. But the shelves, they were almost bare. Mrs. Henderson whispered, "He left." Melissa stepped inside first. "He couldn't have." She searched the bathroom. Nothing. She opened every drawer. Empty. Eric slowly walked toward the writing desk. Everything on its surface had been arranged with deliberate precision. In the center rested a thick folder. His hands trembled as he opened it. The first document was a property tax receipt. The second was a homeowner's insurance policy. Then came maintenance invoices stretching back several years. Roof repairs, heating system replacements, plumbing work, landscaping. Every bill had already been paid. Every receipt carried the same signature. Jonathan Carter. Melissa frowned. He must have collected random paperwork. Eric flipped another page. Then another. Every document listed the same property address. The house they were standing in. Mr. Alvarez looked over Eric's shoulder. "Those aren't random." Mrs. Henderson pointed toward a business card tucked inside the folder. "Isn't that David Holloway?" Eric picked it up. It was the same attorney who had visited the previous evening. Suddenly, memories rushed back. His father leaving the house once every month, carrying the same worn leather folder. Coming home without saying where he'd been. Quietly filing papers in his desk. Eric had never asked. He had simply assumed retirement meant errands. The front doorbell rang. A courier stood outside, holding an overnight delivery envelope. Signature required for Eric Carter. Eric reached for the electronic pad. Melissa stepped in front of him. "I'll sign." The courier handed her the envelope and left. She opened it confidently. The confidence vanished almost immediately. Her face drained of color. Eric took the papers from her. Across the top of the first page in bold letters were the words, "Notice of termination of occupancy agreement." His eyes moved lower. "Property owner, Jonathan Carter." He looked at Melissa, then back at the page, then back again. Melissa's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Eric." She swallowed hard. "Why is your father's name the only owner listed?" Eric read the first page again. Then a third time. The words refused to change. "Property owner, Jonathan Carter." He looked up at Melissa. "There has to be a mistake." "There isn't," she replied, though her voice had lost every trace of certainty. She grabbed the rest of the documents and flipped through them. Every page carried the same address, the same legal description, the same owner's name. Jonathan Carter. Eric sat heavily in one of the dining room chairs. "I don't understand." Mrs. Henderson quietly excused herself, sensing the family needed privacy. The other neighbors followed, leaving the front door gently closed behind them. The silence that remained felt heavier than the crowd had. Eric hurried into the hallway closet, where old family files were stored. Dust covered several cardboard boxes. He began pulling them onto the floor. "What are you looking for?" Melissa asked. "The mortgage." He searched through years of paperwork. Utility bills, insurance renewals, old tax returns. Then he found a folder labeled 2018. Inside were unopened notices from the bank. His hands froze. Final demand. Notice of default. Foreclosure proceedings initiated. The memories came rushing back. His construction business had nearly collapsed that year after two major clients declared bankruptcy. He had missed months of mortgage payments. He remembered sitting at his kitchen table, convinced his family was about to lose everything. Then somehow, the problem had disappeared. His father had simply told him, "Everything's been taken care of, focus on rebuilding." Eric had believed the bank approved a restructuring plan. He had never asked another question. Melissa stared at him. "You knew about this." "I knew we almost lost the house." "You never told me." "I thought." He stopped. The truth was painfully simple. He had never wanted to know how the crisis had ended. His father had spared him the embarrassment, and he'd accepted that gift without asking what it had cost. Melissa opened another section of the legal packet. Attached to the occupancy agreement was a schedule of conditions. She read the first page aloud. Residents shall not interfere with the owner's reasonable enjoyment of the property. She turned another page. Residents shall not remove, dispose of, or permanently relocate the owner's personal property without written permission. Another page. Residents shall not intentionally restrict the owner's access to shared living areas. Then another. Documented emotional abuse, intimidation, or attempts to establish false mental incapacity shall constitute material breach of agreement. Melissa's face turned pale. She slowly lowered the papers. Eric looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means that..." She struggled to finish the sentence. Someone documented everything. The attorney's business card was still lying on the table. Eric called immediately. David Holloway answered after the second ring. "This is Eric Carter." "I know. I need to understand what's happening." "You've received the notice." "Yes." David spoke calmly. "Your father instructed me to explain only after service was completed." Eric gripped the phone tighter. "He owns the house. He has owned it since purchasing it outright during the foreclosure proceedings 8 years ago." Eric closed his eyes. "So he paid everything?" "Yes. And he never told us. He specifically instructed everyone involved to keep your dignity intact." Eric couldn't speak. David continued. "Your father also instructed me to preserve every piece of evidence he provided." "What evidence?" "Photographs of missing belongings." Eric looked toward the nearly empty bookshelf. "Written communications." He remembered dismissing his father's complaints. "Medical records." Melissa slowly sat down. "Security camera images showing personal property being removed from the residence." She covered her mouth. "Dates documenting restricted access to shared spaces." Every small decision. Every careless comment. Every excuse. None of it had disappeared. Jonathan had simply chosen not to argue. He had documented. David's voice remained professional. "Based on the documented breaches, Your father exercised his contractual right to terminate the occupancy agreement. Melissa suddenly stood. You never told me any of this. Eric looked at her in disbelief. I didn't know. You handled the finances. I thought we were making mortgage payments. We were. No, Eric whispered. We were making payments to him. The realization hit both of them at the same moment. Jonathan had never been collecting rent. He had been allowing them to rebuild slowly while protecting the home. Melissa sank back into her chair. What have we done? 3 days later, another envelope arrived. Inside was a simple handwritten note. Meet me Saturday, 10 o'clock. Lakeside Cottage. Come if you're ready to listen. Saturday morning arrived with gray clouds hanging over the lake. Eric parked outside the cottage. He expected an uncomfortable conversation, perhaps even forgiveness. Instead, he stepped out of his car and froze. Moving trucks stood beside the cottage. Workers carefully carried bookshelves, boxes of novels, and Jonathan's furniture through the front door. His father wasn't coming back. He was already moving forward. Eric stood motionless beside his car as another worker carried a stack of carefully labeled boxes into the lakeside cottage. Each carton had neat handwriting across the side. History, poetry, American classics, letters. Jonathan wasn't rushing. He wasn't hiding. He was building a new life. David Holloway noticed Eric standing near the driveway. Mr. Carter is expecting you. Eric nodded quietly. Melissa followed several steps behind, unusually silent. When they reached the back porch overlooking the lake, they found Jonathan arranging books onto freshly built shelves. He looked up. You're on time. Neither of them knew what to say. Jonathan gestured toward 3 chairs. Sit. They obeyed. For several moments, only the sound of water moving against the dock filled the silence. Finally, Eric spoke. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? Jonathan smiled sadly. Tell you what? That you own the house. Jonathan rested his hands on his cane. Because it wasn't important. It was everything. No, Jonathan replied gently. Saving my son was everything. Eric lowered his head. Jonathan continued. When your business failed 8 years ago, the bank wasn't negotiating anymore. I remember. They scheduled the foreclosure. Eric nodded. I remember thinking we'd lose everything. You would have. Jonathan looked across the lake before continuing. So I sold your mother's investment account, withdrew most of my retirement savings, and bought the property before the foreclosure sale. Melissa stared at him. You paid for the entire house. Yes. Why? Jonathan looked at Eric. Because he was my son. His answer was so simple that it hurt more than any accusation could have. I knew if I told you the truth, your pride would never allow you to accept it. So I created an occupancy agreement instead. Eric listened without interrupting. You and Melissa made affordable monthly payments, not because you owed me rent, but because I wanted you to rebuild your finances without carrying the shame of believing your father rescued you. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. I thought. I know what you thought. Jonathan nodded. You believed the house belonged to both of you. He reached into a folder beside his chair and slid a copy of the agreement across the table. I also included one condition that mattered more than every other clause. Eric looked down. Printed near the bottom of the page were the words, the owner shall always be treated with dignity, respect, and unrestricted access to his home. Jonathan tapped the sentence gently. That wasn't legal language. It was personal. Eric's hands trembled. I broke it. You both did. Melissa wiped her eyes. I'm sorry. Jonathan looked at her kindly. I believe you are. She struggled to continue. I thought I was making the house more organized. Jonathan nodded. You weren't organizing a house. You were deciding which parts of another person's life deserved to remain. She covered her face. The books. Jonathan smiled faintly. Do you know which one you closed that afternoon? Melissa slowly shook her head. It wasn't just another novel. He reached toward a small wooden table beside him. The book rested there. Its worn cover had been carefully repaired. He held it gently. Your mother gave this to me on our first wedding anniversary. Eric looked up immediately. Jonathan opened the cover. Inside, written in elegant blue ink, were the words, "For Jonathan, because every great love deserves another chapter." Signed, Emily. Eric stopped breathing for a moment. I never knew. You were too young to remember. Jonathan carefully closed the book. When Melissa called it nonsense, he paused. She wasn't insulting paper. She was dismissing one of the last things your mother ever placed in my hands. No one spoke. The silence said enough. After several minutes, Jonathan finally broke it. The greatest wound wasn't losing control of the house. It wasn't even losing my belongings. He looked directly at his son. It was watching you stand there and decide that keeping peace with your wife mattered more than standing beside your father. Eric's shoulders shook. I'm ashamed. I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. Jonathan leaned back. Forgiveness and trust are different things. Eric nodded. I understand. The court process will continue. Jonathan's voice remained calm. I'm not changing that decision. Melissa looked up. We'll leave. You should. You deserve to live here peacefully. Jonathan gave a small nod. I've spent my entire life making room for other people. It's time I made room for myself. Over the following weeks, Eric and Melissa moved into a modest rental across town. There were no dramatic arguments. No attempts to fight the court's decision. The evidence Jonathan had documented spoke clearly enough. Relatives who had admired Melissa's confidence were stunned when they learned what had really happened. Several apologized to Jonathan after seeing the legal records and photographs. Word also reached many of Jonathan's former students. One Saturday morning, 3 of them arrived at the lakeside cottage carrying lumber, paint, and bookshelves. Another donated comfortable chairs. A retired carpenter built reading tables. Within 2 months, Jonathan transformed the front room of the cottage into a small community reading space. Every Wednesday afternoon, retirees gathered to discuss classic novels. On Saturdays, children filled the room with questions, laughter, and curiosity. Jonathan was teaching again. Not because he needed a paycheck. Because he had rediscovered the part of himself that no one could take away. Months later, Eric knocked quietly on the cottage door. This time, Jonathan opened it immediately. I brought dinner, Eric said. Jonathan smiled. Come in. Their conversations were careful at first. Trust returned slowly, built through consistent actions instead of apologies. Melissa also visited from time to time. She never touched another book without asking first. Some lessons cannot be taught in classrooms. Others take a lifetime. That evening, after Eric left, Jonathan carried his favorite novel onto the porch overlooking the lake. He settled into a wooden chair as the sun disappeared beyond the water. He opened the familiar pages. No one reached across to close the book. No one told him what mattered. For the first time in years, every chapter belonged entirely to him.